The mafia boss witnessed his mother in distress. Then a brave maid stepped in. The chandeliers hung like frozen constellations. Each crystal, a small, indifferent sun. Light slid off polished marble and gilded frames, catching on the diamonds and the glass, for the wealthy and the well-placed. The music was a slow, syrupy waltz that hovered over the room like perfume. Laughter braided with the clink of champagne glasses. Beneath that glitter, the ballroom smelled faintly of old money and something sharper. The metallic temps of power kept under tension. From the shadowed mezzanine, Lorenzo Moretti watched. He could have been a gargoyle carved from obsidian set apart, high and cool, with the city unfolding beneath him. He wore a suit as dark as the corners of his gaze. People called him an architect-builder of businesses, of alliances, of fear. Tonight he was merely a man whose attention had been stolen by a small, trembling movement on the marble floor. Isabella Moretti drifted like a stray leaf between columns. Her hair, silver as river stones, was pinned with one pearl that had survived more winters than she had the patience for. The dementia that crept with her years was not a huge thing the way novels make it. It arrived in small losses misplaced, a memory like a firefly gone dim. Tonight, among strangers, her confusion was a raw thing, visible and exposed. Beatrice Vane noticed. She always noticed what could be turned an awkward pause, a falter, and sharpened it into spectacle. Her lips were the precise color of a scandal, her laugh a practiced knife. When Isabella paused too long in front of a portrait, Beatrice stepped forward, as though closing a door. The room, tuned to gossip's frequency, bent inward. "You shouldn't be here," Beatrice cooed, which in that air read like a command. She took Isabella's elbow with an arrogance that smelled of entitlement and cheap perfume. A glass tipped. A waiter glanced away. Someone thought it a joke, and laughed hard enough to hold a joke like a weapon. Isabella flinched. Her hand flew to her chest as if to find the name of the person who'd once been her husband, to find the room she had known. Her eyes found nothing familiar. The crowd pressed closer, exhaling judgment like smoke. Sophie Clark was on her knees beside a decorative fountain, 2 floors down, polishing the base, marred by fingerprints nobody wanted to see. Her apron had a dark ring where coffee had given up the fight hours ago. There were holes in the heels of one shoe, patched with improvised stitches, and the hem of her dress bore the smudged evidence of subway rides and long shifts. A slip of paper poked from the apron pocket. Toby, school schedule. A note that read, "New inhaler, refills prayers," written in the language of survival. When Beatrice's hand tightened like a clamp around Isabella's elbow, something that had been muffled in Sophie's chest, the tiredness, the hunger, the shame of being invisible, suddenly lined up with the present. A woman was being reduced to spectacle. Someone had to stop the room from applauding cruelty. Sophie stepped forward. She was not loud. Her voice was not trained for ballrooms. She was a low, practical thing, the sort of voice you used to tell a child the stove was hot. "Ma'am," she said, and it was all the firmness she could spare. "Let her be." Beatrice turned, surprised the way people who expect unanimous affirmation are surprised by dissent. She smiled as if Sophie had made a joke she didn't understand, and, with the grace of privilege, shoved Isabella's shoulder just enough to make the old woman stumble. Champagne sprayed like a mock snowfall across the carpet, and someone in the crowd clapped as though this were theater. Sophie moved faster than she thought she could. She caught Isabella's arm and held her steady beneath the pearl pin. The champagne landed on Sophie's apron, staining it a bright, ridiculous pink. A guest made a sour remark, something about servants who should know their place. Sophie looked at that guest and found that her sight had the peculiar clarity of someone with nothing left to lose. She didn't blink. She stepped between Beatrice and Isabella and, with hands that smelled of lemon oil and laundry, guided the old woman away from the circle. For a long beat, the room held its breath. The chandeliers reflected 100 tiny judges. Lorenzo moved, small as a thought, the way a predator moves through prey at the threshold of strike and mercy. He never applauded. He did not laugh. He waited to measure the cost. He descended the mezzanine in a series of decisions made of steel and math. His boots barely whispered against the stairs, but they registered. Men in dark coats straightened like metronomes when he passed. He watched Sophie as she steadied Isabella, watched the damp circle on Sophie's apron, the way she kept her shoulders squared, though the heat in her cheeks was likely shame and anger braided together. In that single moment, Lorenzo's world, which was built on architecture of control, encountered an unpredictable support beam. A working-class girl, who had stood where others had chosen to watch. He could have made an example. That was the thing about him. When he chose to be a force, he could make it final. He could have wiped Sophie from the memory of the room so effectively that the lesson would be repeated for generations. This is how order is kept. Instead, he did something gentler and stranger. He stepped forward and put one long, careful hand on Beatrice's arm. "Enough," he said, and his voice folded over the crowd like a curtain. It was not a plea, not entirely a command, just an uncomplicated fact that the room resisted for a breath and then obeyed. Beatrice, affronted, found some smile to paste over the irritation. She released Isabella as though the moment were over and turned away with the dignity of one who believed dignity was a currency you could spend without saving. Lorenzo did not speak to the crowd. He crossed the floor and stood a small distance from Sophie, where his shadow could not quite reach her shoes. He watched the way she cradled Isabella's wrist as though it were something precious and breakable. A man in a tuxedo offered Sophie a handkerchief, sincere kindness. Sophie waved him off. She had the practical look of someone who could not spare "You shouldn't be here," Beatrice muttered under her breath on her way by. It was a recoil, an irritated insect. Sophie looked up. Her eyes met Lorenzo's for the briefest instant. Within them was exhaustion, yes, but also a vigilance that spoke of nights spent guarding a smaller, more fragile life. Lorenzo allowed himself a small, private intake of breath. He read not only the present this act of defiance but the ledger beneath it. A single mother, perhaps, or a sister, a family with needs that were daily and unforgiving. He catalogued her in the way he catalogued more dangerous things, by potential and by risk. The calculus was automatic, clinical. "Come with me," he said to Sophie, and it landed on her like a sentence and a key both. He did not say it loud. He stepped close enough that she could count the reluctance and the care in the fossilized tilt of his mouth. The ballroom quieted to a hum as people processed that their evening might rearrange itself. Lorenzo's bodyguard, Silas, shifted like an echo behind him. His face was a map of old bruises and loyalties. The proximity of those two men alone was an ecosystem players didn't cross without thinking first. Sophie's mind moved faster than she felt. Hands that had known the rhythm of soap and linen, of bowls and late-night homework, had to make room for the new understanding. If she walked with this man, it would change everything. If she declined, she risked nothing and kept everything. If she accepted, Toby might have heat, medicine, a steadier table. She could almost hear the list of bills in her apron pocket whispering her name. "Why?" she asked before she could stop herself. Lorenzo's answer was not a speech. He tilted his head toward Isabella, who stood steady now, watching the strangers in a way that did not yet match names to faces. "Because she is alone tonight," he said. "Because someone chose to shame her." The sentence was spare, but it carried with it a promise that rolled darker than any garment in the room. He would protect what was his. There was a logic to the proposal he made then, practical as a ledger. He would hire her to tend to his mother, room and board, a small stipend for Toby's schooling. He said the words deliberately, allowing her to imagine a life where bills stopped arriving like bad weather. There were rules. He added discretion, living within the estate, a quiet code of silence. That last clause fell between them heavy as winter. Sophie heard the terms, and heard the unstated margin beneath them. A life under the Moretti roof would mean safety, opportunity, but also surveillance. It would mean her name might be exchanged for a calculation by men who never loved except as strategy. It would mean giving part of her freedom for the surety of another's. Sophie's mind went to Toby, first his laugh, the way he tucked the inhaler under his pillow, the scuffed sneakers he refused to throw away because they had been a present from a teacher. She thought of the small, hot panic of learning that medicine costs more than the week's wages. She had learned a private kind of bargaining in the years she juggled rent and grocery lists. She could bargain now, demand tuition for herself, a guarantee for Toby's care, a time limit before reassessment. Her voice did not shake when she spoke. It was precise with the thing she wanted most. A promise inked in fairness. "You teach me to be what I need to be," she said, "and you take care of him. I won't sign away his life for a roof." She wanted it to be blunt. The words landed with a light thud on Lorenzo's suit. He listened. For a man accustomed to being the maker of rules, listening to bargaining was a different muscle. He found himself intrigued by the lines of her mouth when she negotiated it small, unafraid of consequence. There was a quiet dignity in her demands. He approved it, not easily, but with the slow acceptance of someone who knows the value of solidity. They met in the corner of the ballroom as the party resumed its orbit. A small, formal document was drawn up, less a contract than a promise in ink. He offered not servitude but employment, wages, a room in the estate above the library, PAID tuition for a nursing program at a discreet local school, and a weekly visit guarantee for Toby. In return, she would be the elder's companion, a constant presence, and she would keep the household's privacy. The papers smelled faintly of lemon oil and new ink. Sophie looked at the ink as she signed. Her hand wavered only for a moment when she thought of what companionship might look like, long days of quiet, the management of a small corpse of memory, the patience of someone whose life had been measured by need rather than by desire. She thought about how she could use a certificate in nursing to open a door away from cleaning rooms and hiding holes in her shoes. She thought of Toby sitting up at breakfast, inhaler on the table, no more frantic phone calls to the clinic. She thought of the soft, unromantic relief of bills that no longer marched in her shadow. The signature was a small rebellion. She would take power where she could find it. It was not heroic in any cinematic way. It was pragmatic, like mending a leaky roof before the storm. Leaving the ballroom, she walked between the columns and the waiters, with Lorenzo at her side. The night air slapped against her cheeks when they stepped outside, a wintry slap that felt like honesty. Lorenzo did not offer flattery, only a curt nod at the car. His driver held open the door. Silas folded into the back seat like a weathered coat. On the ride to the estate, the city leaned past them in a smear of sodium light. Sophie sat with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the weight of the choice, like something that might crush or rescue her. Lorenzo watched the road more than he watched her. The world beyond his window was a city arranged in terms of risk and revenue. He had built this life to keep certain things from spoiling. The sight of a woman who refused to watch another be humiliated had unsettled those designs. "You could have left it alone," Lorenzo said at last. His voice was a low instrument, something like curiosity and something like accusation braided together. Sophie met his eyes, then not as equal yet, but not bowed either. "I couldn't," she said. "Not when someone's dignity was on the floor to be stepped on." He allowed himself a small, private, almost tender laugh. It sounded absurd to him, the sensation that passed under his ribs, as if someone had set a hand against his sternum and apologized. He had not expected tenderness in a place built on advantage and debt. He made a note of it. The Moretti estate was everything a person could imagine when they thought of power. Iron gates that closed with mechanized finality, clipped hedges like soldiers standing in formation, a low line of lights that suggested security rather than welcome. Inside, the house retained the scent of old books and strong coffee. Isabella's room held orchids that had lived longer than most of the guests had marriages. The staff moved with quiet choreography, a world where privacy was curated like a jewel. At first, Sophie felt like an intruder in a museum she had cleaned for years, with no one ever thanking her. She was shown to a modest room above the library, furnished not as a servant's cell, but as a small consolation. A bed, a desk, a window that looked out over a garden, kept to a geometric perfection. In the room's drawer, she found a packet of school brochures, tuition forms already partially filled. It was the sort of practical kindness that felt as dangerous as a bribe. Isabella, in her soft moments, liked music that had once been popular in a time when the city moved slower. She liked to hold Sophie's hands and say names that came back as light. Names of children long grown, of streets that no longer existed. Sophie learned to play records on a player that clicked like an antique clock, to hold a teacup and listen with the patient concentration of someone who was untangling a small knot. There was a tenderness in the small rituals, straightening the bedspread, tucking a shawl around Isabella's shoulders, learning which words would stir a remembered smile and which would bruise the fragile sense of self she still retained. Sophie's hands, once calloused from cleaning, grew gentler under the task of care. The nature of dignity is often woven from small, repetitive acts that say, "I see you." Lorenzo watched most of this from a distance. He would drop in on the afternoons less and less as the weeks passed, watching the exchange like a man, scrutinizing a painting for hidden signatures. His presence altered the air in the house, the way a storm alters light. The staff straightened more than furniture, and Silas's eyes seemed to be the color of always noticing. The estate had rules, the unspoken kind. Certain doors were never opened, certain hallways were never spoken of. Cameras glinted like insects in eaves. Meals were served with quiet ceremony. Sophie found herself measured by shifting standards she had not expected to navigate. How to be friend and employee, how to be companion and not confidant. The more she learned to tend to Isabella's small failures and triumphs, the more she realized that her own life was tightening around a different shape. On evenings when Isabella slipped into lucidity and spoke of the past with fierce clarity, Sophie learned that the woman had once been generous in a way that had nothing to do with money. She had loved with fearless abandon, with small rebellions, a man who painted, a garden she had planted, alone. In those moments, Sophie saw a woman beneath the fog who had, like her, made choices based on necessity and love. There were dangers embedded in the home that even the careful walls could not hide. One night, a nurse, Nurse Hopkins, arrived with a smile smooth as glass. She moved in a way that suggested competence and a practiced softness for the elderly. She was a practical presence in the household, which Sophie at first welcomed. But there was something about the nurse's hands, the way they lingered too long on Isabella's wrist. The way she watched the staff as if counting them, that caused a small, steady discomfort in Sophie's gut. It was not yet fear. It was simply a prickly awareness. Sophie kept her distance, but she took note. There were other details a letter left misfiled in the study. A car that idled too long beyond the hedges that laid like breadcrumbs she did not know if she should follow. Lorenzo watched, too, but his attention was like a map folded into a pocket. Only when he chose to open it did the lines become evident. Friends and acquaintances of the Morettis came and went. The house entertained men with sharp suits whose hands smelled faintly of grease, more accounts of a business than people. Beatrice's name made its comfortable rounds through the conversations, like something that could not be scrupulously avoided. Sophie learned the social codes quietly. What not to say, how to hold a teacup so that no one caught on to the tremor in her fingers when she thought of Toby's patient cough in the night. There were small gifts, too, that arrived like apologies for a life that otherwise thrummed. A parcel once appeared at Sophie's door, new shoes, sturdy, with a note in Lorenzo's handwriting that simply said, "For walking." It was not patronizing. It was an observation turned into action. Sophie dropped the package on her bed and allowed herself a private laugh that tasted like relief and embarrassment at once. In her new routine, Sophie found the odd pleasures that come of competence gained. Learning to fold a shawl so it would not crease, Isabella's delicate shoulders, coaxing a soup from stubborn winter vegetables that soothed a cough. With each successful moment, she collected a small, luminous coin of confidence. She began classes a week after moving in. Practical nights spent learning the technicalities of respiration and medication skills that would change the measure of her work forever. The economics of belonging shifted to, for the first time in years, Sophie could imagine a future where bills did not arrive like a threat. She could imagine Toby in a school uniform that did not bear the wear of frantic repair. She started to plan in small increments tuition, a deposit for an apartment that might someday be solely hers. Dreams like that gathered like winter birds on a wire, plausible and precarious. Still, there was always a tension in the house, a tautness like a string that might snap if plucked wrong. Security men moved like punctuation marks at every threshold. A window left ajar at night was not merely oversight. It was a potential breach. Isabella's name was currency, and currency attracts appetite. Sophie felt her own privacy erode and then rebuild into a new shape of safety. The price was an existence under observation and a set of constraints that required constant negotiation. One afternoon, while Sophie and Isabella sat in a sunroom that smelled of dry grass and tea, the old woman turned her head and said, with the lucid warmth of someone remembering a small kindness, "You have honest hands." Sophie smiled, palms tingling at the compliment. "I do my best," she answered. Isabella tightened the shawl, and added, "You were brave at the gala." The gaze that followed that remark was the kind that saw more than the speaker intended. It landed on Sophie, lingered on the faint scar near her knuckle and old kitchen burn and refocused on the lines of her mouth. "The brave ones," Isabella said, "are the ones who keep others safe, even from laughter." Sophie let the words sit with her like a warm thing. She had not expected praise like that. The old woman's voice contained no calculation, only a gratitude that seemed old and simple. It reached parts of Sophie that the wage and the tuition forms could not. Outside, beyond the clipped hedges, the city carried on its usual exchanges of power. The Moretti name opened doors and closed wounds, which sometimes meant the family made choices that rippled beyond the garden and into neighborhoods where need and cruelty traded with equal zeal. Sophie learned this gradually, through overheard conversations, through the strange shape of political invitations and the smell of cigar smoke in rooms where promises were made that had nothing to do with kindness. The tension that would knit the rest of Sophie's life into sharper lines did not announce itself with fanfare. It arrived as a whisper, a courier who misdelivered a small envelope to the wrong mailbox, and then returned, flustered. Phone calls with clipped ends. A lovely senator's wife, who found it easier to be cruel than accountable. Nurse Hopkins began asking questions that did not sound like a nurse's concern. Where does Isabella keep certain papers? Who else knows the details of the house? Sophie diverted them, as much to keep the old woman's dignity intact as to keep from acknowledging the sound that rose in her chest. Worry made of gooseflesh, and thought. Lorenzo noticed the tension too. In Fisher's small but honest way the staff tensed when certain cars appeared at the gate, the way certain men lingered on the boundaries of the property, like marks on a map. He moved with economy when he addressed the household. A word here, a rearrangement there. He did not permit fear to become a currency, but he prepared as one prepares a room for possible thunderstorms, by placing heavy things against the windows and keeping the pantry full. Sophie continued to do what she had always done: tend, fix, speak softly to a woman who sometimes could not locate her own name. Only now she had the additional knowledge that danger moved beyond the hedges and that the house, big and insulated as it was, could not ward off everything. That knowledge lived behind her ribs like a small, persistent bird. There was a moment when she found herself standing in the library, holding a bronze bust she had dusted that morning. The bust was a man's head, chin lifted in such arrogance that it seemed to mock the very act of humility. Sophie turned it in her hands and felt the weight of history. She thought of the gala, again the way a laugh could push someone into shame. She thought of Beatrice and her practiced cruelty. She thought of the way Beatrice's eyes had flicked at Isabella like someone drunk on advantage. For a long, unglamorous minute, Sophie allowed herself an angry fantasy. In it, she took the bust and threw it across a ballroom, shattering some myth of immunity. Then she told herself, with a calm that was practical rather than noble, that fantasies do not feed Toby or pay tuition. She set the bust back on its pedestal and smoothed her hands clean on her apron. When Sophie left the library, she found Lorenzo by the window, watching a rain that had come in a thin, dignified line. His profile against the glass was the clean cut of a man who had solved many problems with decisions that never required apology. He had returned earlier than usual. "You worry?" he said without turning. Sophie shrugged. "The house is full of people who have something to lose." She kept the sentence small, like a coin in her hand. Lorenzo's jaw soft briefly. "You have something to protect," he said. "You'll look at things differently than the rest of us. It's useful. Usefulness." Sophie tolerated seductions of power, pragmatically. If he meant his words as praise, it was a praise that would have to stand aside from the practicalities of knights and bills. "I am not a tool," she replied. "I am a person, Mr. Moretti." He smiled then, a fraction of something that might have once been considered warmth. "I know," he said. "That's what makes you dangerous. It was a compliment wrapped as a caution. Sophie took it in and tucked it away, not as flattery, but as information on the ledger of her life. She would be something in this house. It would not be only survival. It might become a craft. Outside, in the gardens beyond the high walls, headlights carved the hedges into streaks of light. Sophie glanced at them, then back at Isabella, who had dozed off with a hand folded over a record sleeve. Something moved in the deeper darker car, slowing, a figure stepping out, then too. Sophie's skin prickled. She felt a small, old instinct she had learned as a child, in rooms where noise meant danger and silence meant watching. She straightened and reached for a lamp. The house stirred like a hive under the smallest cough. She did not know yet what the cars meant. She did not know whether the men beyond the hedges were merely lost or whether they were the thin tip of something else. Something that would test the household's promise. She collected the small muscles of calm she had built, breathing, counting, making lists inside her head. Lorenzo's hand found the back of her elbow, a quick, private anchor. "Stay inside," he said. It was a command, and also a promise. His voice carried a guarantee shaped by implications. Sophie looked at him and realized how much of her life had been tunneled into this moment. The estate had given her shelter, but shelter could become a gilded cage if its gates existed only to keep you compliant. She stepped to the window and watched the headlights dim into the hedges. For the first time since she had signed the papers in the ballroom and traded holes in her shoe for an address above the library, Sophie felt both the fullness of possibility and the weight of a climate she had not chosen. Outside, the wind pushed branches against the stone. Inside, Isabella slept with a small, peaceful frown that softened when Sophie smoothed the blanket back over her knees. Sophie said the small prayers she had learned, prayers of practicality, for Toby's breath, for steady wages, for the courage to claim dignity when it came in unexpected forms. She did not know then what the night would bring. She only knew that she had stepped between a woman and humiliation, and that the act had changed the geometry of her life. She had accepted protection in exchange for vigilance. She had promised to play a part in a household that moved on the edge of power. She had thought she had bargained only for safety. The Moretti house, with its walls and gardens and personnel, had other ideas. The things that move outside hedges do not always knock politely. Sometimes they test the seams of promises. Sophie stood at the window and watched the dark. And somewhere in the underlayer of the house, someone cleared their throat, as if preparing for a conversation that might upend everything. Pause and think, what would you have done in Sophie's place? Comment below. The headlights swallowed themselves in the hedges and then reappeared as dark mouths opening at the iron gate. Sophie watched them slide along the gravel, watched the way the light cut the garden into carved pieces. She had not yet named the thing that tightened in her chest as fear. There were so many words the world had taught her to use for small emergencies: worry, annoyance, inconvenience. This felt heavier, older. It moved with purpose. The first sound was not a gunshot. It was metal against metal, a muffled clank that might have been a bolt catching or the hesitant answering of men who expected welcome. Then the alarm sang, long, thin, and terrible, and the house became a set of sharp, organized motions. Staff appeared in doorways like notes on cue. Silas was at the gate before Sophie registered that he had moved. Lorenzo was behind him, as if the dark had always been folded into his shadow. The perimeter lights flung their white at the intruders. Two figures dropped down from a car and moved toward the gate like men who had already decided what they were owed. A second car halted. More men spilled from it. Their faces were hard shapes. They were not aristocrats here to gossip. They carried the quick, quiet gait of people who thought in taking. Sophie felt the house contract around her. Staff moving to strategic places. The old kitchen door slammed. Voices counting. She thought of Toby sleeping in a small room above the stables, of the inhaler on his bedside table. Her breath shortened, and then she replaced breath with action. She had been hired to protect an old woman's mind from being trampled. Tonight, the house itself was under test. A gun fired once in the distance, too close to be a warning. The kitchen door burst open and a man in a leather jacket lunged. Hair matted with rain, hands already searching for what a man like him always intended to find: weakness, in people and in places. A porter who tried to block him went down hard. The room smelled suddenly of ozone and sudden fear. "Get Isabella to the inner parlor," Lorenzo said, voice a low machine. He moved with the clean, implacable motion of someone who had practiced the geometry of crisis. Silas barked orders like a man reading a map in a language the rest of the staff did not know. The household separated into lines, defenders and those shepherding the vulnerable. Sophie found herself beside Isabella before she fully understood how she had closed the distance. The old woman sat upright, eyes wide and blank for a breath, then flickering with that sudden, affecting lucidity. "They're here," she said, as if naming gave the house an anchor. She reached for the shawl Sophie had tucked around her shoulders and gripped it like a rope. Through the hallway came the sound of voices, men speaking with a cadence Sophie recognized from less public things. Threats disguised as business. Nurse Hopkins appeared at the threshold of the medical room, a paper bag clutched in her hand as if it were evidence of a normal, bedside errand. Sophie's stomach lurched. Something in the nurse's expression was too smooth, too practiced. The small misgivings Sophie had felt in the weeks prior thrummed, now sharp as a needle. Hopkins' pupils were steady, unfazed. She stepped aside and led a tall man across the threshold as though she had forgotten who was allowed and who wasn't. The first intruder reached the library. He shoved past a young footman who tried to bar him and lunged for a shelf, hands rifling for safes or for papers that carried names. Sophie saw the flash of an arm reaching for the elder's room, for the place where family documents and secrets slept. She moved as she always had without fanfare, by the small muscle of habitant, intercepted him. The man turned. He expected a shriek or a scurry. He did not expect a small woman with work-rough hands wrapped around a heavy bronze bust. Sophie swung. The bust struck the intruder's jaw with a dull, decisive sound that rang in Sophie's bones like the ending of a sentence. The man staggered, blinking blood into the air, and for a single stunned instant the house had a possibility of resistance that was not preordained by men with history. Sophie did not think of the fancy phrasing of heroics. She thought of a boy in a sweater with a cough that sounded like a broken hinge. She thought of a woman whose name drifted in the wrong direction when she reached for it. Her hands did what they had always done. Acted, tended, held. She grabbed the stunned man and pushed him toward the door with an authority that surprised even her. The house cried out sharp footsteps, a clatter. Lorenzo's men converged like tide and boulder. The first wave was not meant to be negotiated. It was meant to set the tone. They would show they could take without asking. Nurse Hopkins stood by the hall now, her smile perfectly composed. Beside her, a man Sophie had seen at parties, an opportunistic figure who smiled with the practiced amiability of those who trade in favors, moved with too much ease. Sophie's steps slowed. The picture formed clear as glass. Hopkins' sympathies had been sold. The nurse's hand brushed a sleeve as if in apology, and then let it go. "Hands off the old woman," she hissed at Hopkins, voice low and urgent. Hopkins' mouth tightened. The man at her side reached for Isabella and was met by Sophie's elbow. The intruder's face was a map of disbelief. Why had a servant chosen to block him? That disbelief would cost him. A second shot exploded somewhere in the courtyard, and the ground under Sophie's feet trembled as if the earth itself had decided to become a drum. Lorenzo's presence cut the room into new orders. He was an instrument of surety now, his hands moving, not like a man who wanted to meet punishment, but like someone who had catalogued all possible threats and selected the most efficient neutralizer. He tackled one man to the ground with a motion that was almost elegant, precise, economical. Silas punched with a force that threw a thin man against a marble column, which crumbled a little under the impact. Sophie shoved Isabella into an inner study as a man lunged at them. The intruder's gloved fingers brushed Isabella's shawl, leaving a smear of dirt like a scar. Sophie turned and, with the last of her breath, offered herself. "Take me," she said, voice surprisingly calm. "Take me if you want someone." The offer was not stupidity. It was a measure, a trade she had been trained to make. "Take me and leave the child and the old woman." She read the logic in the men's faces. Hostage as currency. The idea of being used as leverage nestled itself against Sophie's ribs like a suffocating cloth, but she put the cloth there deliberately, a sacrificial calculation for the small lives that mattered to her. One of the intruders laughed short and ugly, but then Nurse Hopkins stepped forward and bowed her head with a motion that suggested obedience to orders given earlier. She whispered something to the tall man and the axis of the plan shifted. The order was to capture Sophie and a decoy child, drag them into a car, and make demands. The men worked like this: seize, demand, profit. Sophie let them take the rope that bound her wrists and the scarf over her face and heard the click of the car doors. They led her through the house, past Lorenzo and Silas, and a dozen eyes that measured rage and relief in equal parts. For a breath she felt naked and furious and utterly alive. She thought, absurdly, of the patched shoes in her closet, of Toby's inhaler under his pillow. She rehearsed little arguments in her head. "You hurt Isabella. Lorenzo will find you." But she could not say Lorenzo would always be on time. She could only be on time herself, which is what she had always been. They bundled her into a car that smelled of damp leather and cigarettes. The back seat was a confessional of possible harms. A man sat beside her who smelled of oil and old knives. Her black nails dug into the upholstery as they drove. The hedges blurred. The world shrank into a tunnel whose end had been decided by men who thought only in extraction. Inside that car, the plan should have been simple. Take the servant, hold the woman, call for ransom. But plans that assume compliance forget the varied resource of a person's refusal. Sophie had no training in hostage negotiation. She had something else that night: the small inventory of the kitchen knives, pots, knowledge of how things break. She had the bronze dust in her hands and a stubbornness that tasted like iron. When the car stopped, she felt along the seam of the seat and found a small sliver of medlar rivet loosened over time. With a movement that would have made no sense in the movies, she used it to work free the rope around her wrists. Her hands were raw and slick with sweat. She bit the inside of her cheek until it tasted like copper. She waited until the tall man left the car with the engine running. When the man returned, Sophie was crouched, as if she had always been preparing to spring. The metal tasted like a promise in her mouth. She used it to unfasten the latch of the door and slipped out as if the night had been shaped, not by threats but by the small, resilient knowledge of how seams give. She moved without flourish-old learning. Crouch low, stick to shadows, become part of the night. She ran. The men who had kidnapped her had assumed they were clever. They had not expected the house itself to be a net. The Moretti estate had been designed to be stubborn in ways that mattered. As Sophie crossed the lawn, she saw the second car, heard noises as elbows and boots met, and then Lorenzo's voice, low and furious, and nearer than logic would allow. He was already there, intercepting a man who had a gun. Silas had the man's arm twisted so hard a small, exhausted cry broke free. Lorenzo's coat was dark in the moonlight, and his hands were the business of consequence. She tried not to look at him, but her knees betrayed the need to know what he'd done. As if he could read that short-lived curiosity, he turned and caught her by the arm. She expected the iron, the command. "What were you thinking?" But what she heard was a different sound. Shock and something like shame for the cost she had paid. "You shouldn't have gone out," he said. It was not anger alone. It was a mapping of all the ways the house had failed its promise to keep the things she loved safe. He helped her stand and then, impossibly, folded her into his coat as if he feared she would fall apart if left to stand alone. Inside the house, Toby was woken by the noise of men moving like storms. He was no more than a boy, but the sound of panic was an old creditor of his. Sophie found him in the stairwell, eyes wide, inhaler clenched as if his life were a fragile thing to be guarded. When he saw her, he tried to smile through the strain and the tears. "You okay?" he asked, voice small. Sophie hovered for a long beat, weighing words. "We are fine," she lied, and then corrected herself, because truth was what he needed now. "We're not fine, but we're together." Lorenzo's fury was not the coarse kind printed in headlines. It was precise and terrifying. He moved through the house like a man with blueprints in his head, cataloging the wound, the mailbox, the nurse who had sold favors, the men who had thought to test a wall and found a fist. He had meant the estate to be a place that refused penetrations. That night, someone had found a seam. The aftermath of violence is always quieter than the violence itself. The men who had been captured were tied in the servants' yard, eyes glazed with fear and rain. The police would be called, and the notes of police would be written. But Lorenzo did not trust the slowness of the law in a moment when a name could be erased in a single, clean action. He filled the house with an economy of motion doctors, bandages, counsel. He locked certain doors forever. He made the kind of arrangements that do not fit into polite conversation. Sophie's head pulsed with a battery of small injuries. Her knuckles were bled and bruised. The cut above her eyebrow made a small, angry line. When they insisted she go to the infirmary, she protested the househead nurses. After all but the insistence of practical concern wore her down. Lorenzo's hands were steady as he wound a clean bandage on her temple. His fingers skillful, like a man who had learned to do hard things without breaking them. He watched the blood darken the cloth and then disappear, as if he could swallow the wound whole. "You should rest," he said. There was no softness in command. There was care, shaped by an awareness that some things must be held tightly if they were not to be lost. In the hospital wing, the surgeon, or the man who did most of the house's more private medical business, cleaned a bad bruise on Sophie's hand and tucked sterile strips along the cut. Sophie watched the procedure with the calm of someone who had been observing pain her whole life. The thought of tender hands on her was almost funny. She had grown used to being the holder of other people's hurts, not the receiver. Lorenzo sat beside her as the sun came up like a tentative, watchful thing. His face had acquired a tired softness, as if someone had left a candle burning in its interior and it had melted the sharpness. He did not speak much. His hands were eloquent. He brought her tea that tasted of bitter leaf and something searingly domestic. And when she laughed a small, surprised sound, he smiled in a way that was less habit than a new learning. "You saved my mother," he said at last, as if the sentence should be worn like an amulet. It did not require praise. It required acknowledgement. Sophie's bandaged fingers toyed with the edge of the cup. "It was a mess," she said. "People were crowding." He listened to the bluntness of her summary and then let it go. "You offered yourself?" he said. That was not expected. It was not a question. It was an observation made by a man who had catalogued the human heart in charts and found that some lines were undecipherable only because he had refused to read them. "I did what I could," Sophie replied. "I did what any person would do." He considered the claim, turning it over like a coin. "Most people would not," he said simply. The sentence landed without judgment. It was a ledger line. She did not like praise rooted in the exceptionalness of a deed. She preferred praise that acknowledged the ordinary stubbornness of kindness. But there was more in his tone than praise. There was a weight. He had been built to protect, and his building had been undermined. Her action had both insulted his system and revealed an honesty he could not punish. The weeks that followed the breach were a study in repair. The house took on a defensive sharper watchfulness at the gates, an invisible checklist for every person who crossed the threshold. Nurse Hopkins was gone by morning, gone with a trunk, and a story stitched together from plausible lies. The men who had entered the gate were interrogated and sent into custody, processed by people who liked to believe that justice sat behind a desk. But the wounds, Sophie's bruised hands, Isabella's tremor when a certain laugh arrived, were slower to be counted. Sophie's recovery was practical and stubborn. She went back to her classes when stitches allowed and moved through the house in a slow, new choreography. Her hands still remembered the feel of the bronze bust, the weight and the sure arc of momentum. At night, she woke, gripping the bedsheet with a pressure she told herself was for practice. The emotional cost of violence is not always visible. Sophie found herself startling at small noise, siesta, squeal of a delivery truck, or the far-off bark of a dog, each a small echo of the night. She slept less. She held Toby closer, their evenings threaded with new rituals. Checking inhalers, leaving doors unlocked in ways that felt uncertainly defiant, teaching him small things about the geometry of safety. Lorenzo watched. He watched the way her smiles sometimes fell like a coin into a well and never returned. He watched the way she made lists for the world. Groceries, bills, which medicines were due. He watched the way she handled gratitude and anger with equal thrift. He did the oldest thing for a man like him. He tore up the formal document that had defined their arrangement. He called her into the inner parlor where a fire burned as if it had been kept alive for such conversations. The paper lay on the desk between them, a contract with tidy clauses and clean ink. Sophie almost expected him to bargain for new terms. She had learned the language of agreements, and the ink was a kind of safety she trusted. Instead, he took the paper and her pen, and he locked the desk, and then with a gesture that felt like ceremony, he ripped the sheet into uneven pieces. The sound was smolder tearing of paper, but it felt like an earthquake under the world they inhabited. "What are you doing?" Sophie asked, surprised more than alarmed. "Removing the ledger," he said. "You did not sign away your life. You signed into a job, and we treated it like an item on a balance sheet. That was wrong." His eyes were not seeking for agreement. They were seeking for permission to undo an old way of seeing the world as a series of transactions and people as columns to be Sophie had never expected this kind of uncalculated mercy from the man who measured power like architecture. "You could have used me," she murmured. "You could have." "I could have," he interrupted, quietly, "and I almost did. But watching you the other night, you were braver than the house allowed for. I want something different." He did not make a speech. He extended a hand instead, not a hand that demanded loyalty, but a hand that invited partnership. It was an offer rooted not in ink but in shifting geometry, the arrangement of two people choosing to stand on the same side of a thing. Sophie took his hand. The gesture was simple, practical, no grand declarations, only a new contract built on presence and intention. They did not name their future all at once. They mapped small things, a private set of rules that would not be written in a ledger. Education, equal voice, decisions that affected Toby or Isabella. He promised tuition to be accelerated, a fund set aside for Toby that no household accountant could touch. She promised to speak plainly. They agreed to watch each other when the world grew cunning. In the months that followed, their intimacy grew like the careful architecture of a house being rebuilt. It was not an explosion of passion carved into cliché. It was quiet dinners where the lids were taken off conversation. Mornings where Lorenzo brought coffee to Sophie's classes and stood in the doorway like a witness more than an owner. Their touches were tentative at first. A hand placed at the small of her back, a finger that drew absent lines along a bruise. Consent was explicit in their speech. Questions asked and answers given. Each act of closeness was paid for in honesty. The sex of it, when it came, was private and respectful, a language learned through conversation and the slow unfolding of mutual care. They found that tenderness did not obliterate the past. It layered over it like a new coat of paint that still let some old wood show through. Isabella watched them in her own way. On some evenings she would hum a tune from a past age and pat Sophie's hand. "You've found your place," she would say, meaning both the room and the more difficult position of belonging to someone. On others she would lapse into silence, eyes glassy with memory's sea, and Sophie would sit with her, holding an anchor of presence for a woman whose mind drifted. Life at the Moretti house became a new kind of work. Public appearances were fewer and quieter. Business moves were made with a more careful hand. Lorenzo used his power differently, not out of sudden conversion but because the architecture of his life had been altered by a new load-bearing wall. Sophie's courage. He began to use influence to shield, to create small corridors for people who would otherwise be trampled by the machinery of the city's upper crust. Not all of it was saintly. He still brokered deals and made alliances that left moral residue, but he began to allow pockets of tenderness where once there had only been transactions. Sophie's classes finished ahead of schedule. She graduated with a certificate that felt like a new pair of shoes, sturdy, sensible, a thing she wore with pride and practical joy. Imagine a person who has learned to hold others from the place of a trained skill and a heart that refuses to grow small. That was Sophie after the crash of the Nightmare, confident in her competence and less willing to be invisible. Toby grew steadier. The inhaler regimen held. He learned a joke about the way the big house's guards looked like punctuation marks, and he began to dream not of simply surviving, but of small possibilities. A trade school, a job that did not exact humiliation, a life in which he could make a choice that did not feel like indebtedness. 6 months later, the ballroom called them back on, event that had once been a stage for humiliation, and now felt like a place of reckoning. The chandeliers were the same, but the light fell differently on the faces gathered. People had not forgotten the incident, nor the name that sat at the center of it. The room buzzed with the same perfume and the same appraisal, but with an added curiosity. What had changed in the Moretti household? The crowd wanted to see the map of consequences they had helped draw. Sophie did not want to stand at the center. She had learned to live in the edges where work is done and dignity is preserved. But she stepped forward because things transform only when someone shows the world a new line of possibility. She wore a dress that had cost more than she had ever paid for a single garment, but she wore it like armor and also like a flag. I am here, and I am not ashamed. Lorenzo stood beside her. He did not hold her as though she were his trophy. He stood with a profile that had not softened into sentimentality but had sharpened into respect. He had learned to watch people for their needs, and not just their utility. When he introduced Sophie as the woman who had become Isabella's companion and a nurse in practice, it was neither a headline nor a claim of ownership. It was an announcement of partnership. The room reacted in the way rooms always react. A rustle, a reed. Beatrice watched them from a distance, mouth a thin line. The senator's wife had cultivated cruelty as a favorite habit, but that night the habit met something inconvenient. Public example. The hush that followed Sophie's name was not only fascination, it was a recalibration. Privilege had been exposed, not dismantled, but rearranged. Sophie moved through the crowd with the steady, practiced gait of someone who had always done these things but now did them visibly. People leaned in to speak conciliatory words from those who felt guilt, opportunistic words from those who smelled influence. Sophie answered with an economy of words, letting the shape of her life speak louder than the small prattle that battered around her. At one point she saw a figure she recognized, a young woman bent over a tray, her shoes scuffed and eyes tired in a way that mirrored Sophie's own old exhaustion. The woman moved like a shadow, sobbing a host de Evres, without looking up. The sight lodged in Sophie's chest. She had been that woman, once, elbows thin with fatigue and dignity half hidden under aprons. Sophie squeezed Lorenzo's hand and excused herself. She walked to the woman and stopped, seeing in her the same set of small, stubborn muscles that had made Sophie step between a cruel joke and an old woman's dignity months before. Sophie placed a coin figuratively and literally into the woman's palm, an offer of work at the Moretti household, a stable wage, and an invite to speak for herself. The woman looked up at last, eyes wide with the dangerous light of disbelief, and Sophie saw in her the old hunger for possibility. Later, as the night wound into calmer rhythms, Sophie and Lorenzo stood apart from the chatter and watched Isabella dance a slow, tremulous step led by a man who had offered his elbow without needing to be asked. The music softened into something older, and for a beat the house was a small, fragile world held together by hands that would not let go. "You changed your life by standing up," Isabella said to Sophie when she came to rest near them, breath warm in the cold air. "You changed someone else's by that small choice." Sophie thought of the bronze bust, of the bandage on her temple, of nights when the house had felt too loud. "Not by myself," she said. She meant the household, the man who had torn up a contract, the boy who made her accountable for his life. She meant the sum of small hands that had reached out and held. Lorenzo watched them both and then turned to Sophie. "You taught me something," he said, "that not everything can be planned. Some things have to be protected because they are human." "Thank you." Sophie did not need more. She had wanted steadiness for Toby, for a future where the bills would be a list to be traded rather than a threat. She had wanted to be seen and to do work that mattered. Some nights she still woke thinking of the men who had chosen to test a gate and realized horror only when the door opened to human defiance. But those nights diminished under the steady light of a life rearranged. The world did not become kinder wholesale. There were still men who measured worth by price tags, and still women who found cruelty easier than accountability. But the Moretti name shifted slightly, unpredictably toward a shape that bore the scars of what had happened. Power, they learned, could be used to shelter rather than only to exact Months after the gala, Sophie found herself in the kitchen chopping onions, hands steady as always, when a knock came on the pantry door. A woman stood there fresh from another town, frightened, asking for work. Sophie looked at her and remembered the feeling of being small and unseen. She guided the woman into the house with a steady voice and a cup of tea. Part of Sophie's promise, part of the new architecture of the life she now led, was to give others a way out of the small, suffocating choices she had once known. Years later, people would tell the story in different tones. Some would whisper of romance that softened a man who had built his life on edges. Some would say that tenderness had corrupted a system that needed to be ruthless. Sophie, who knew the math of trade and the truth of small things, would correct them gently. It wasn't a fairy tale, she would say. It was a choice to act, and then to stay breathing after acting, to keep doing the ordinary care that makes life livable. Lorenzo kept doing what he had always done. He rearranged business, he brokered deals, he acted with a decisiveness that unsettled and settled in equal measure, but now he did so with an awareness that strength without mercy was brittle. Sophie kept tending hands and bills and the small economies of life. She kept learning medicine and human patience, and she taught Toby to make lists that ended in hope. The title, moment, the place where the boss saw his mother in distress and a maid stepped in remained the hinge of everything. Not because it was dramatic, but because it revealed the human arithmetic beneath a life of power. Someone chose to be honorable when the room chose laughter, and that choice altered trajectories. Sophie could have done nothing that night. She chose instead to act, and the world rearranged in response. In the end, what mattered, perhaps, was not that a mafia boss softened, nor that a servant rose in rank. It was that dignity, when defended, multiplied. It made a boy safer. A woman remembered. A community of small hands believed that possibility might come if you stepped forward. It made people accountable. When Sophie closed her eyes at night, she sometimes saw the ballroom's lights in a long ribbon, and she understood that the glitter had always been part of the city's way of disguising hard choices. Now, when she passed a woman with tired feet or a child with a cough in the market, she thought of the small, practical ways to help. It was not always grand. Mostly, it was steady, the slow accumulation of kindness in a ledger that refused to be measured only by coin. Tell the story you'd change. Would you have intervened? Leave your answer in the comments.